To be very clear, for those who aren't aware of what this regulation Kevin just referred to is, this is going to require 32.6 million small businesses to have to register their beneficial ownership information with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network by January 1st, 2024. Let me repeat that. Over 32 million businesses are going to have to register with FinCEN by January 1st, 2024. And they're going to have to register a copy of their driver's license, business information, and anyone who has when you say beneficial ownership information, that means anyone who has a 25% greater stake in the company or any senior officer of the company, such as a CFO. So this is a pretty daunting task and probably the biggest regulation that no one is talking about right now.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. NFIB and our members advocate to keep America's small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
Welcome to the Small Business Rundown, your place for information on independent businesses' victories and challenges in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. I'm Adam Temple, NFIB Senior Vice President of Advocacy. On today's episode, we're getting an update on key issues and legislation affecting small businesses with a specific focus on developments coming out of the U.S. House and Senate. We're joined by three of NFIB's federal government relations experts, Vice President of Federal Government Relations Kevin Kuhlman, Government Relations Director Jeff Brabant, and Government Relations Manager Jocelyn Castillo. Together, they'll discuss some top legislative priorities and advocacy efforts this summer. Kevin, Jeff, Jocelyn, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So the three of you recently hosted an NFIB Federal Update webinar for small business owners, and I know you have a lot to cover, so I'll turn it over to you to give our listeners the latest news on a few of the key federal advocacy issues that you discussed here in Washington.
Thank you, Adam. The webinar provided a federal update on important issues including taxes, financial services policies, labor law, and health care. We went over forecasts and expectations on each of the issues. Jeff, what is the consensus for overall congressional action?
Well, Kevin, given that the Senate is narrowly controlled by Democrats and the House is narrowly controlled by Republicans, we expect few bills to be approved by both chambers and signed into law. There are must-pass bills in both chambers, such as extension of government funding and a farm bill that expires September 30th, and must-pass year-end legislation like the National Defense Authorization Act, which expires on December 31st.
Let's get started on our discussion of issues on a pervasive small business topic. Small business taxes. NFIB successfully pushed back against problematic tax increases that were included in the president's budget proposal, as evidenced by zero tax increases being included in the debt limit deal that was enacted earlier this summer. How? We enlisted the grassroots army of small business owners, with multiple small business owners testifying, collection of over 21,000 small business owner signatures and submitting those into congressional hearing records, and collecting small business owners' stories about the problems with the proposed tax increases. At this point, though, we want to shift from playing defense to playing offense. Specifically, we are ramping up education efforts, activating grassroots activity, and lobbying members of Congress and senators to support the Main Street Tax Certainty Act, a bill that would make the 20% small business deduction, also known as Section 199A, permanent. This crucial deduction expires in just over 2 years, clouding small businesses' ability to plan for the future. According to NFIB research, half of small businesses say the pending expiration date harms business planning. Fortunately, bills to expend the 20% small business deduction have been introduced in both the House and the Senate. The Main Street Tax Certainty Act was introduced in July in the House. It has over 100 co-sponsors, which are essentially members of Congress who have committed to vote for the bill if it is brought to the floor. The Senate version, which was introduced in May, has 20 co-sponsors supporting it. While this is a high watermark for both support in the House and the Senate, we will continue to work to build up support.
Thank you, Kevin, for that update. Obviously, this is a high priority that impacts a majority of our membership. So what do you think the prospects for the Main Street Tax Certainty Act are for this Congress? And do you have any other updates for our listeners on other tax activity that we might expect?
Jocelyn, the Main Street Tax Certainty Act will be a marathon, not a sprint. Congress is a very deadline-driven institution, so I don't expect a vote in either chamber this year given the closely divided Congress. But the more support we can build in the House by running up those co-sponsor numbers, the more we are likely to receive a vote next year before the election and still in this Congress. This will tell us who truly supports pro-small business tax policy. Speaking of deadlines, There were some earlier expiring business tax provisions, like the ability to immediately deduct research and development expenses. That expired last year, forcing companies to amortize their R&D expenses over 5 years instead of immediately in the year the expenses were made. Restoring immediate deductibility could be paired with an expanded child tax credit toward the end of the year. While it's not a certainty or even likely at this point, I could see a deal coming together by the end of the year and included in one of those must-pass pieces of legislation toward the end of the calendar year. Stay tuned. Jeff, both the House and the Senate have been active on financial services policy that impacts small businesses. What's the latest in your world on those issues?
Well, July was quite a busy month with the Credit Card Competition Act. That's the legislation, if you're not familiar with it, that would inject competition into the credit card processing market. And this would allow a small business owner, when processing credit card transactions, to have multiple networks to choose from to give them competition to help bring down prices and bring down rates. So that's really what we were really looking at last month. And last month, there was nearly a vote on the National Defense Authorization Act on the Credit Card Competition Act as an amendment. Senator Roger Marshall was offering it. Unfortunately, due to Senate backroom dealings, it didn't come to fruition, but we are hopeful to get a vote by the end of the year.
Jeff, you mentioned that there was almost an amendment vote in July on the defense bill. Do you think there are any opportunities for a vote on the Credit Card Competition Act when Congress returns from the August recess?
Well, there's a bill called the Recoup Act. While NFIB doesn't have a position on this bill dealing with executive compensation that can be clawed back for failed banks, there is a hope that Senator Marshall can offer his amendment on the Credit Card Competition Act to the Recoup Act. And if that were to happen, that would give that type of legislation a real chance at passing.
Thank you, Jeff. A substantial regulation that impacts only small business owners is right around the corner in the financial services world as well. Could you provide an update on the beneficial ownership information reporting requirement regulation?
To be very clear, for those who aren't aware of what this regulation Kevin just referred to is, this is going to require 32.6 million small businesses to have to register their beneficial ownership information with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network by January 1st, 2024. Let me repeat that. Over 32 million businesses are going to have to register with FinCEN by January 1st, 2024. And they're going to have to register a copy of their driver's license, business information, and anyone who has when you say beneficial ownership information, that means anyone who has a 25% greater stake in the company or any senior officer of the company, such as a CFO. So this is a pretty daunting task and probably the biggest regulation that no one is talking about right now.
Yeah, I agree. It's one that I think we just surveyed, and about 90% of our members have never even heard of it and are very unfamiliar. And it's right around the corner. On that beneficial ownership reporting requirement, do you think the regulation kicks in January 1st, 2024?
Well, we'll see. NFIB is pushing for a full repeal of this legislation. We feel it's unnecessary. However, administratively, there is a chance that FinCEN delays it. There's also a chance that Congress delays it for 1 year. The statute allowed for up to 2 years for reporting for companies once this is passed on January 1st. However, FinCEN chose 1 year, so FinCEN can choose to delay it another year, and that's something we hope they do because, as you just said, the survey showed 90% of small business owners have no idea that this thing is coming, and yet over 32 million of them are going to have to start reporting on January 1st, and failure to report is going to result in criminal or civil penalties.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's daunting. It's scary. It's an agency that small business owners have very little familiarity with. So we will continue to push for some sort of relief from that regulation, as well as prepare our members in case it does kick in January 1st, 2024. Appreciate that update. Switching from the headache of regulations to the headache of healthcare policy, we'll shift to Jocelyn. According to NFIB's Problems and Priorities survey, rising health insurance costs have been the number one problem for small businesses for nearly 40 years. Jocelyn, we know there's a lot of activity, but maybe not a lot of productivity. Can you provide us an update on the healthcare legislative front?
Happy to. And, you wouldn't know it from the news, but there's been a flurry of activity in this space, which we welcome with enthusiasm. Lawmakers have been taking bite-sized approaches to healthcare affordability with mixed levels of support across the aisle, as you may imagine. So let me touch a little bit on what the House has been working on. The House cleared a package earlier this year called the Choice Arrangement Act, which would really expand the coverage options for small business owners, allowing them to band together to purchase insurance through association health plans and ensuring that they have access to arrangements like ICRAs, which are tax-preferred arrangements that they may offer to their employees should they choose to buy insurance on their own in the individual market. We were very excited about that legislation, and we key voted in favor of it. Next up is the Patient Act. This is where most of the energy, Kevin, has been when it comes to healthcare and in a bipartisan fashion. It is transparency and preventing consolidation in the healthcare industry. There seems to be a sense that the high cost of healthcare is a result of too much industry consolidation and perhaps a little bit of misbehavior from certain industries. We've heard, for instance, about the infamous PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers. These are middlemen that negotiate drug prices for employers with drug manufacturers, and many of them are engaging in practices that are resulting in higher costs for employers. And so there is legislation pending in both chambers that would increase transparency for employers. Over in the Senate, the conversation has been mostly around drug pricing and lowering prescription drug costs, with Senate Democrats being in charge. It's a little bit of a mixed bag approach to lowering costs, so we expect actually a Senate package to hit the floor here in September that would have those PBM transparency reforms. It would ensure that the pharmaceutical industry is not abusing their patents, but it might also contain certain mandates that are dangerous for employers and that could actually increase premiums. So we'll be watching vigilantly and hoping that what comes together is actually something that can move in a bipartisan fashion and get signed into law later this year. But I'll tell you, our message has been strong and simple. Our members and small business owners need options, we need flexibility, and we need to tackle the root cause of high cost of healthcare, which is industry misbehavior. So any opportunity that we have to tell our story is one that we need to take because the incumbents that are interested in keeping status quo are quite powerful, and so we need to get out there and tell our story.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Appreciate that update and that rundown. We got the House working on increased choices and maybe some transparency and competition, the Senate doing a little competition and some drug pricing reforms. So they're kind of rowing in the different directions, but any optimism for healthcare legislation being agreed to and perhaps signed into law this year or maybe next year?
Well, I think the energy is there for some of these competition transparency policies that would empower employers with the information they need to lower costs and to better manage their benefits. There's also a bill that would streamline reporting requirements. And so all of these things are in the mix for an end-of-year package. As you know, we don't really know what's possible until the very end of the year when negotiations are happening. But the activity in both chambers and each committee of jurisdiction is really something that we are energized about, and we think that there is an opportunity for something at the end of the year, so stay tuned.
Thank you, Jocelyn. NFIB will remain active on these issues and many other policy areas that impact small businesses. We appreciate the opportunity to provide that webinar update. We will continue to do so quarterly and appreciate the time and the opportunity to share on the podcast.
Okay, and as we wrap, I want to thank each of you for your persistent efforts alongside NFIB members, most importantly, to advocate for their ability to own, operate, and grow their business. Before we go, Kevin or others, is there anything else you'd like to cover?
To help with our advocacy efforts, we need NFIB member small business owners' help. The most important advocacy tool at NFIB's disposal is small business owners' stories about how these policies impact them. For example, we'd like to hear about how the 20% small business deduction has helped your business and your employees. Small business owners can look at line 13 on their Form 1040 to quantify the tax relief they received. How did you use that deduction to invest in compensation or benefit increases, or increase business investment, or create jobs?
I would like to leave our members with this. In regards to the Credit Card Competition Act, if you are a small business owner and you accept credit cards and you're getting crushed by credit card fees, you need to reach out to your member of Congress. They need to hear your story. They need to hear specifically how it affects their business. They need to know where it ranks in terms of your total expenses. So you have rent, you have labor, you have a number of expenses. Is it your number 2, your number 3, your number 4, your number 5 expense? These are things your members of Congress need to know. They need to hear them quantified, and they need to hear your story, because the story from one of our small business members is the most powerful lobbying tool we have.
Jeff, I couldn't agree more, and it's the same in healthcare. In fact, 98% of small business owners have said that it will be unsustainable to offer health benefits in the next 5 to 10 years. So it is so important that our members that are struggling with costs share their story, specifics. What is burdening you? Is it paperwork? Is it rising premiums? Is it the lack of options? Because you're right. At the end of the day, here in DC, we are liaisons, but what's most powerful is the stories from our members back at home in the backyards of each of these lawmakers. So I could not agree more.
I think that's a great place to put a pin in it, and we really appreciate you, Kevin, Jeff, Jocelyn, for your time today to tell us about what's happening with small business issues in Congress. For those that are interested, you can listen to that webinar that they discussed at the on-demand link on our show notes. And now I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on today's Small Business Rundown. We'll be back every 2 weeks bringing you news and analysis from Washington, D.C. and state capitals so that you, whether you're a business owner or a supporter of one, can continue to blaze a trail.
The Small Business Rundown is brought to you by NFIB, the voice of small business. You can find us at nfib.com and on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.